Hebrews chapter 5. Before we go into chapter 5, I want to mention, I had a question on verse 14 of chapter 4. Seeing then that we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession. And the King James has profession. New King James has confession. Let me get back over to my the app I know how to use. I can only look at 2 translations on it. Michael showed me this Logos app where you can actually have 4 windows, and you got just a window in each corner, and you can have 4 different translations open at once. And so I was laughing, telling him, because I've been using my iPad as notes. I said, well, I'll just start printing my notes, and I can use that for different translations. But the New King James has confession. Let us hold fast our confession there at the end of verse 14. And the question was just, why the difference? What is the difference? And the short, succinct answer to that is there is none. It's the same thing. It's one of those words that, for some reason, the King James translators will sometimes put confession, but most of the time they put profession. But it's the same Greek word. In fact, 1 Timothy, make sure I got the reference right. I know it's in chapter 6, but I think it's verse 13. Yes, where Paul says, I give thee charge in the sight of God, who quickeneth all things, and before Christ Jesus, who before Pontius Pilate witnessed a good confession. Same Greek word, but it's translated confession here as opposed to profession. But same word, same meaning. It literally means to speak the same thing as, or something to that effect. But there's no difference, just a slightly different word there in the New King James. So I did want to mention that before we go into chapter 5. Now, going into chapter 5, we left off last week. We finished up chapter 4. And yes, the bulletin has gone out this week. So I mentioned the article by Papal. It's called Hebrews 4, 14 and 15, Our Great High Priest. I went ahead and ran that in this week's bulletin. So you can see that. It's an excellent article, a little bit further detail on kind of the end part of chapter 4. But man, it's a really good article. So continuing that thought, going into chapter 5, that thought of Jesus as our great high priest, and because of him we can come boldly before the throne of grace. So he says, verse 5, For every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. Now he's going to make some points here about just priests in general. Priests taken from among men, and of course Jesus being a man, there's some commonality. Who can have compassion on the ignorant and on them that are out of the way, for that he himself also is compassed with infirmity. And by reason hereof he ought, as for the people, so also for himself to offer for sins. No man taketh this honor unto himself, but he that is called of God, as was Aaron. Now, obviously, from verse 3, this is where this is a point that is not common between Jesus and high priest taken from among men. They don't have that in common, because Jesus didn't have to offer for himself because he had no sin. But there's a lot of commonality here. So also, verse 5, Christ glorified not himself to be made an high priest, but he that said unto him, Thou art my son, today have I begotten thee, as he saith also in another place, Thou art a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. Now let's stop there and notice a few things. Again, he's continuing this thought from chapter 4 about Jesus, our great high priest. We've talked about before, the key word in Hebrews is better. And here he's talking about we have a better high priest. Really, it's a better overall priesthood, period. But here particularly thinking in terms of the high priest. But the high priest had and has under the new system even, a work to do. But thinking about the high priest under the Levitical system, well, he was taken from men, ordained for men. He served, again, thinking of the Levitical priest, high priest, he served Israel in approaching God. He would offer gifts and sacrifices, both for himself and for the people. And again, that's where Jesus is going to differ, because he doesn't offer sacrifice for himself. But the difference between a priest and a prophet, does anybody remember this? We talked about this last week. What's the difference in a priest and a prophet? Right. And I was just sitting here thinking that was not the best asked question, I guess, because there could be a lot of differences between them. But the contrast we were making last week is that a priest would approach God on behalf of man, right? Whereas prophets typically approach man on behalf of God. And of course, as we pointed out last week, really neat thing about Jesus is that he is prophet and priest and king. He's got it covered every which way. So the high priest, though, was himself a man, but he had to offer for himself. Now, we won't do this every single time, but I do want to look a couple of different times at some Old Testament passages here, because, especially here, because we've pointed out before, there's so much background for this book in Leviticus. But if you want to go to Leviticus 4, I'll just notice a few verses from here. Again, the priest sometimes would have to offer for himself. Well, pages are sticking together. Leviticus 4, and really begins about verse 3. If the priest that is anointed do sin according to the sin of the people, let him bring for his sin which he has sinned a young bullock without blemish unto the Lord for a sin offering. And it goes through the process of all the details of that offering, really on down through verse 12. But, the priest was a human, and he made mistakes. And so sometimes he had to offer for himself. And in fact, if you go just a little bit further, let's go to the book of Numbers. Numbers 15. Just for a little bit further detail here on the context of these offerings. Did I get that right? Yeah, okay. And pick up in verse 22. And it says, if ye have erred and not observed all these commandments which the Lord hath spoken unto Moses, even all that the Lord hath commanded you by the hand of Moses from the day that the Lord commanded Moses and henceforward among your generations, that it shall be, if aught be committed by ignorance, right, without the knowledge of the congregation, that all the congregation shall offer one young bullock for a burnt offering, for a sweet savor unto the Lord, with his meal offering, his drink offering, according to the manner, and one kid of the goats for a sin offering. Verse 25 says, and the priest shall make an atonement for all the congregation of the children of Israel, and it shall be forgiven them, for it is ignorance. And they'll bring their offering, their sin offering, and then verse 26 says, and it shall be forgiven all the congregation of the children of Israel, and the stranger that sojourneth among them, seeing all the people were in ignorance. And if any soul sin through ignorance, then he shall bring a she-goat of the first year for a sin offering. So first you had the congregation, now it's an individual. And the priest shall make an atonement for the soul that sinneth ignorantly, and it shall be forgiven him. End of verse 28. You shall have one law for him that sinneth through ignorance, both for him that is born among the children of Israel and for the stranger that sojourneth among them. But, verse 30, the soul that doeth aught presumptuously, whether he be born in the land or a stranger, the same reproacheth the Lord, and that soul shall be cut off from among his people, because he hath despised the word of the Lord and hath broken his commandment. That soul shall utterly be cut off. His iniquity shall be upon him. So there's this offering for ignorance. Again, high priest may be offering for himself, and he would at times. But there was also what we call presumptuous sin. We've sometimes used the description, or it's something that I say from time to time to describe it, eyes wide open sin. And he says there's no offering for that. That soul is cut off. You say, I know what God says, I don't care, and you sin, that soul was to be cut off. But now, back to one more passage in Leviticus 16. And this, just about the entire chapter, details the Day of Atonement. And I don't want to read the whole chapter. Obviously, we'll run out of time, but early part of the chapter, he tells them to make sure Aaron is instructed. You don't come at all times into the holy place within the veil before the mercy seat. This would be what we would call the most holy place. You don't just walk in there. There was a certain set time for that, of course, that being the Day of Atonement. But then he details when Aaron does come in there. And really, just to kind of grab a few key verses here, verse 5, he shall take of the congregation of the children of Israel 2 kids of the goats for a sin offering, and 1 ram for a burnt offering. Aaron shall offer his bullock of the sin offering, which is for himself, and make an atonement for himself and for his house. And then you can drop down to verse 11. Aaron shall bring the bullock of the sin offering, which is for himself, and shall make an atonement for himself and for his house, and shall kill the bullock of the sin offering, which is for himself. And then when you get down to verse 15, then shall he kill the goat of the sin offering, that is for the people, and bring his blood within the veil, and do with that blood as he did with the blood of the bullock, sprinkle it upon the mercy seat and before the mercy seat. All that just to say what we've been saying. The high priest, he offered for the sins of the people, but he also offered for his own sins, because he was a human, and he had sins to offer for of his own. Then when you look at verse 4, the Hebrews writer here, getting back to Hebrews chapter 5, verse 4. The Hebrews writer here says, the high priest didn't just usurp this office. In fact, the closest we would come to an example of trying to do so, it's not really what happened in that instance, but it might be the closest we could come to it. It would be what? Does anybody know what I'm thinking of? Well, Saul did offer not being a Levite. I was thinking in terms of Korah in Numbers 16. They go to Moses and they say, you take too much upon you. Kind of a, who do you think you are? I mean, you just, and Moses really there says, I didn't ask for this. This was, God told me to lead the people. God told Aaron to be high priest. And so, again, I don't know if Korah was trying to usurp that role per se, but he certainly was taking issue with Moses, and he was rebelling against Moses and paid the very high price for it. But the point being here in Hebrews 5, the high priest didn't just usurp that office. And so it was with Jesus. Jesus was called by God. And when we go to Numbers chapter 8. Again, it's really the better part of the chapter. I've got verses 5 through 22 in my notes, but it's just about that entire chapter where, I keep wanting to say Aaron, Moses was told to set aside the Levites and of course, Aaron being the high priest. They're set aside for that service. But the high priest, being one of them, chosen by God. They don't just take that honor upon themselves. Jesus didn't take that honor upon himself, chosen by the Father, and it is one page over. I was going to say it's at the same opening in my Bible, but I do have to go slightly on to the next page. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 14. For it is evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which tribe Moses spake nothing concerning priesthood. Jesus, of course, is from the tribe of Judah. Well, tribes under the law of Moses, or priests under the law of Moses had to come from Levi. So, and he's going to make this argument later on in the book. Changing of the priesthood means changing of the law. Who changed it? Is it just some man? Oh, God changed it. We sometimes talk about change agents, and there are certainly those in the religious realm that are change agents, and they're trying to change God's word, change the worship, change the plan of salvation, and so on and so forth. But not all change is a bad thing. Jesus brought about change, but it was change that was authorized by God. God changed this, not man. By the way, at the end of verse 5, he quotes from Psalm 2, verse 7 in particular. Then in verse 6, quoting from Psalm 110, verse 4, and we won't get into it in depth tonight because Melchizedek's going to come up again later on in the book, and we'll talk about him more then. But he mentions Melchizedek, this king and priest. Somebody, if you would, I've been doing all the reading. Somebody grab Genesis 14, 18 through 20, please. Who's got that? Okay, Bob.
And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tenth of all. And the king of Sodom said unto Abram, Give me the persons and take the goods to yourself. How far?
That's good. So, Melchizedek, king of Salem, but he was also priest of the Most High God. So he was a king and a priest. Jesus is a priest, not after the order of Aaron. That would be impossible because he would be unauthorized. He's from the tribe of Judah. He's a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And again, this is going to be expounded upon later on in the Hebrews letter. Then, when you get to verse 7, that gets us, we're through where we left off there at verse 6. So Jesus, as prophesied, is a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And of course, again, later on when he talks about Melchizedek, he's going to make the point, on earth, priests are changing. Why? Because they die. They're humans. But Jesus is a priest forever because he rose from the dead, never again to die. Then, picking up at verse 7, he says, who, talking about Jesus, in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death, and was heard in that he feared. Though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. Being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him. Now, let's stop there and notice a few things. He's obviously speaking of Jesus here in verse 7 and going forward. I don't know if we could say for sure, but this may well be a reference to what we have an account of in the book of Luke. In fact, somebody, if you would, grab Luke 22, 41 through 44. And while we're getting turned to that, I had this a little note jotted down in my class notes from preaching school that obviously in the flesh Jesus offered up prayers and supplications, but the note there that caught my attention was in the form of a question. If Jesus in the flesh felt the need to pray, what ought that to tell us? You think we need prayer? Do you think that's beneficial to us? Certainly is. And so that like I said, that just stood out to me, and I thought about that, and I thought, boy, that is a good point. If Jesus in the flesh needed to pray, how much more so do you and I? Yes, sir.
Sometimes we're made fun of because people say, "Oh, you fear God. You live in fear." Well, look at this at the end of verse 7. It was heard for his godly fear. This is kind of like one of those, if it was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. Jesus had godly fear. He wasn't living terrified, but he had difficulty. But he feared God. We could follow him in that way.
Absolutely. And that's really the fear of God that the Bible talks about. Fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole of man, or this is man's all, is the way the New King James puts it in Ecclesiastes 12:13. If you're doing what's wrong, you should tremble in fear because, Hebrews writer is going to talk about this in chapter 10 at the end of the chapter. But if you're in Christ and you're striving to do what's right, it's not a trembling fear. It's a reverential, respectful fear, if you want to use that term. Reverence is kind of the word we would tend to use. It's like children. A child fears his dad. He knows if he's done wrong, he's fearful because he knows there are consequences. But at the same time, he looks up to him and he respects him, and it's just, and so he was heard in that he feared. Such a religious reverence for the Father. Who has that passage in Luke 22, 41 through 44? Okay. So possibly verse 7 is referring to that. It certainly seems likely. Again, I don't know if I could say that for sure. By the way, I've mentioned it several times before, but R.C. Foster's Studies in the Life of Christ, that big, fat, thick book that I've brought with me before, man, he's got some amazing thoughts on that passage there in Luke 22. And what it means, when the angels come and strengthen Jesus, it would seem to be a physical strengthening, not spiritually. It's not that Jesus wasn't up for the task, and so the angels come and help him get, pumped up so he can get through this. It would, almost seem like it has to be a physical strengthening because of the stress, being without food for a little bit, and so, but it's, man. Every time I open up Foster's book, I get blown away, but those comments there really are good. But this idea here, when he talks about offering up prayers and supplications, strong crying and tears, it's indicative of his discipline, his self-control over the flesh, the human flesh and its frailties. But it's also indicative of his great submission to the will of the Father. Because even in that darkest hour, he's praying, not my will, but thine be done. And so again, it's the idea of this religious reverence, a reverential fear of the Father in that sense. But it says in verse 8, though he were a son, and really would be better stated, though he was a son, it's not a suppositional thing. Let me get over here. I was looking to see if I can get there. Come on. Yeah. ASV has was, though he was a son, and ESV has that also. That's what I was thinking. But though he was a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. Well, this is one of those verses that, at first glance maybe leaves us scratching our heads a little bit. So did Jesus was he not obedient before? And, it's essentially a rhetorical question, right? It's not that he wasn't obedient before. Did he not know obedience before? He had to learn about it? No, that can't be it.
He learned obedience
By the things that he suffered. I think there's kind of a key in that. By the cross, by his death, actual experience, in other words, that there is one sense in which God, Jesus being a member of the Godhead, he knows all, right? Omniscient. He knows about death on the cross. He knows every single thing that's involved in that. He knew exactly what was going to happen to him. But that's not exactly the same as experience, is it? I mean, somebody could describe something to you in depth. And I mean, sometimes we even say that. Maybe it's reading a book or something like that. We say, it makes you feel like you are there. I mean, that writer is so good. I felt like I was experiencing it with him. Bob shared with me the Lands of the Bible by McGarvey. I hadn't even thought about it when I mentioned it in that Science in the Bible lesson, that it would be out of copyright, and it's actually available in a PDF online. But he sent me a copy of that, and I ended up skipping past Lands of the Bible to the end of the book. I think it's like section 3 or the last section of the book. And he actually, McGarvey wrote letters and sent to the Advocate, maybe? Gospel Advocate? It was to people back in the States. But these had been kept, and so he actually published the letters. But wow. I mean, I was as enthralled by that as his description of the Bible lands, because he describes the journey as he's on this big ship heading over to the Bible lands, and it's but that's kind of how it felt. Felt like I was there. In fact, that was what I told Bob in replying to the email. I was like, man, I want to go back and read some more of these letters, because it makes me feel like I'm just there with him, the way he can just describe the scene. But it's not the same as experiencing it, right? So, seems to be an element of that. Though Jesus was the Son of God, he was willing to learn experientially what it is to obey, particularly what it is to obey even in the midst of suffering. He learned it in the sense of he experienced it practically and experientially learned. A.T. Robertson, in his Word Pictures in the New Testament, says this. He describes this statement here in verse 8 as a succinct and crisp statement of the humanity of Jesus in full harmony with Luke 2:40 and 52. Luke 2:40 says the child grew and waxed strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. Luke 2:52 says Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. And then he also mentions it's in full harmony with Hebrews 2:10, which seems to be a very similar type verse. Hebrews 2:10 says it became him for whom are all things and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons unto glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings. So there's that theme. By the things which he suffered, through sufferings, captain of our salvation, author of eternal salvation. And we pointed out last, I guess it wouldn't have been last class, but whenever we looked at that verse there in chapter 2, that idea, I'm thinking of a different word. Forerunner's the word I'm thinking of. But captain of our salvation, he's that leader. Even then, it kind of carries a similar idea to the forerunner there. But Robertson mentions it's in full harmony with those verses. Then he goes on to say this. He always did his Father's will. And he references John 8:29, where Jesus says, I do always those things that please him. But he grew in experience, as in wisdom and stature, and in the power of sympathy with us. Well, we've pointed this out numerous times. Nobody can stand before God on the day of judgment and say, you have no idea what it's like. You know what it's like to die? You know what it's like to fear death? You know what it's like to be suffering tremendously and try to maintain your obedience and faithfulness to God in the midst of that? Jesus will say, yes, I do. Absolutely, I know what that's like. So I thought that was a good comment there from A.T. Robertson. Again, it doesn't mean Jesus wasn't obedient before, obviously. He submitted to suffering to conquer death. He experienced it. Turn over to, again, it's just a page or so. It looks like it's 2 pages. Hebrews 10. Verse 5 mentions, a body hast thou prepared me. He goes on and says, in burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin thou hast had no pleasure. Then said I, lo, I come, in the volume of the book it is written of me, to do thy will, O God. Above, when he said, sacrifice and offering and burnt offerings and offering for sin thou wouldest not, neither hadst pleasure therein, which are offered by the law. Then said he, lo, I come to do thy will, O God. He taketh away the first, that he may establish the second. He needed a body. He came to do the will of the Father, and there needed to be a body so that he could experience death. And this is why the Word became flesh. Paul talks about this a little bit in Hebrews 2, 5 through 9. But going on into verse 9, here's another one that brings up some question for us perhaps. Being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all of them that obey him. This is where sometimes it is a little bit different. I've got the ESV and the ASV pulled up, so somebody had to help me from the King James, or New King James, which I think is the same as the ASV, which says, having been made perfect. Is that what you got in the New King James? I believe it's the same. King James just says being made perfect, right? Is there any other one that has having been made perfect? Okay. Perfected. Oh, having been perfected. I knew it was close to that. I didn't feel like I was getting that quite right. ESV has being made perfect, like the King James has. But the point here being, again, we sort of, well, was he not perfect before, having been made perfect, or being perfected? He was perfect before. It's not saying he wasn't. In fact, the word used here in the Greek is It's a form of that word we talked about before, teleos. Teleon, I think, is the noun form. But it's Adam Clark, in his commentary. I think this is Clark. I thought I made a note of Clark or Barnes. I was looking at both of them at one point. But it's the idea of having obtained the goal. In fact, this word, or a form of that same word, is used in Romans 10, where it talks about Christ is the end of the law. There it carries the idea of like a finish line. Well, when you get to the finish line in a race, you don't keep running. That's the finish line. Jesus is the finish line for the law of Moses. Well, here it's the idea, very similarly, having obtained the goal, having ended his labor. And here's something interesting to me that it's a little bit puzzling as well, knowing what some of these commentators teach on other things, but still interesting. Listen to what Adam Clark says, commenting on verse 9 here of Hebrews chapter 5. He's quoting someone that he calls Dr. McKnight. Does anybody know who that's a reference to? I could not find anything except just Dr. McKnight in there. Papa, do you know who that's referring to? Of course, Adam Clark's commentary goes way back, so probably was very familiar to his readers, and it may be referenced elsewhere in the commentary. I don't know, but here's what he says. He's quoting from McKnight, and I'm paraphrasing it though. But making the point, this verse teaches three things. Number one, he says, obedience to Jesus is equally necessary to salvation with believing on him. Number two, he, Jesus, was made perfect as a high priest by offering himself as a sacrifice for sin. Number three, by the merit of his sacrifice, he obtained pardon and eternal life for those who obey him. And here's where it gets really interesting to me, because Adam Clark goes on to say, quote, it is not merely believers, but obedient believers that shall be finally saved. Then he says, just a few words later, just truncating it a little bit, this text is an absolute, unimpeachable evidence that it is not the imputed obedience of Christ that saves any man. We must be obedient to the Son of God. And to those that obey, he is the author. This is a word, it's only used here in the New Testament, in the Greek New Testament. But it means the procuring cause, is the way Clark puts it. Again, and he also here references back to Hebrews 2:10, captain of our salvation. But again, you see the superiority of Jesus over that old Mosaic system. So, verse 10, since Jesus was called by God, the point here being, he says, called of God and high priest after the order of Melchizedek, talking about Jesus. Since Jesus was called by God, these Jewish brethren ought to accept Jesus as they did other high priests. They were called by God. Jesus is called by God. Not a Levitical priest under the law of Moses, but a change of the law, a change of the priesthood. He's a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, of whom we have many things to say and hard to be uttered, seeing ye are dull of hearing. He gets right to the point here, doesn't he? Ever had somebody say, hey, there's a lot I could tell you about that, but can't do it right now. And maybe you say, well, why not, man? We got plenty of time. Because you ain't ready for it. What's that supposed to mean? You don't know enough. You ever been told that? I mean, I've been told that before in certain situations. You're just not ready for that. Sometimes in preacher school, we might even have an instructor tell us sometimes, Somebody say, hey, Brother Moser, what about over there in Revelation chapter? We're not even going to touch that. You just wait. We'll get to it. Sometimes hey, you need to do some more studying before you go trying to dive into some of that stuff. And so the writer here tells them, we got a lot of things to say about Melchizedek, but they're hard to be spoken right now because it's not so much that they're not, well, they weren't ready, but it wasn't a lack of capability. It was a lack of doing what they needed to do. He says, you're dull of hearing. For when for the time now you ought to be teachers, you have need that one teach you again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God, and are become such as have need of milk, and not of strong meat. For everyone that uses milk is unskillful in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe, a baby. Spiritual babies. You want to tell me? They get strong with them. But strong meat belongs to them that are of full age, even those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Go ahead, Bob. You were going to say something.
Dull, sluggish, lazy, stupid. Now, this verse that you're just talking about is an indictment upon members of the church throughout the ages, especially in our time. Christians who have been Christians 10 or more years. By this time, you should be teachers. This also tells us that as members of the church, as we mature, we should be getting in some kind of role as a teacher. It doesn't have to be a Bible class role, okay? But we should be teachers.
Absolutely.
Why is it that in Bible schools all across the land, people are having a hard time getting teachers? You know why? Because they have become dull, sluggish, and lazy. Because when they had the opportunity to study their Bible, as they were reminded by their preacher, okay, they did not take that. And the preacher couldn't preach and teach properly at the level he wanted to because the people have become dull. It's up to the individual in the congregation to grow. Now, I say that because I went through a lot of pain to learn my Bible knowledge. And I was not raised in the church. I was a Catholic. If this guy from New York can do it, please don't get a rope, okay? But if this guy from New York can do it, then, other people can do it too.
My pawpaw Dollahite, as we called him, told me one time, and he was he'd preached for years and preached the gospel and was sometimes a little ornery in his old age. And he told me one time he was kind of fussing, and was talking about a preacher and said their local preacher, and he says he's always doing first principle lessons. He said he does a good job. I wish he'd get off those first principles. It's always first principles. And finally I got tired of him saying that to me one day, and I said, Pawpaw, maybe he's waiting for y'all to get those down, and then he's going to move on to something else. And so that's what the Hebrews writer says here. Would y'all get y'all should know this stuff, but I can't go on about this because you're not ready. We got to get down to some first principle stuff. I had a couple more things I wanted to say about these verses, but that's the idea here. He gets strong with him, says, you should know these things already, but you don't. You're spiritual babies. You say that to some folks today, they'd probably just turn around and try to quit the church or something. But he says, I'm getting strong with you. I'm trying to get your attention because you need to hear this. You need to be growing. We got to be strong and we got to grow in the Lord. Be men is what Paul says, 1 Corinthians 16:13. Well, all right, we'll make a couple more comments about that next week, God willing. Thank y'all very much for your time and attention. I'm loving this study. I hope y'all are as well.